Before Columbus ever set foot in the Americas, African sailors had already crossed the Atlantic. Old nautical charts, enormous carved heads, and botanical clues all point to West African kingdoms reaching the New World centuries earlier. But this chapter of history was buried, erased by European colonizers who needed the world to believe they'd discovered empty continents. What if everything you learned about 1492 was carefully engineered fiction? The year is 1312, and the Mali Empire stands as one of the most powerful forces on the planet. It stretches across West Africa like a living golden river, controlling the salt and gold trades that fuel economies from Cairo to Cordoba. Mali isn't just wealthy, it is unimaginably rich, its prosperity so vast that foreign travelers struggled to describe it. Mansa Musa, who would soon become the wealthiest individual in recorded history, hasn't yet ascended to the throne. Instead, his predecessor Mansa Abu Bakr II rules the empire. But unlike most rulers, his mind isn't consumed by conquest or wealth. He's haunted by a single question that stalks him night after night. What lies beyond the vast Atlantic Ocean? This isn't idle curiosity. The Malians were master shipbuilders, expert navigators who refined their maritime knowledge over generations. They built massive vessels capable of transporting people, cargo, and provisions across dangerous waters. They understood wind patterns, ocean currents, and the stars. And Abu Bakr, surrounded by scholars, sailors, and the resources of a mighty empire, refused to accept the idea that the Atlantic was the world's edge. Arab historians, especially the meticulous Al-Amari, recorded what came next. Abu Bakr assembled a fleet of 200 ships, loaded each with skilled sailors, water, food, gold, and everything needed for a long ocean voyage, and issued a simple but chilling command: sail west until you find land or until your supplies fail. Months later, a single battered vessel returned. The captain reported that the fleet encountered a powerful current, a river in the sea, that devoured ships. Only he turned back. The others vanished into the horizon. Most rulers would have halted the dream. Abu Bakr was not most rulers. He did something that stunned his nobles and shocked every corner of his empire. He abdicated the throne, handed power to his nephew Mansa Musa, and ordered the construction of an even larger fleet, 2,000 ships. This time he would lead the expedition himself. In 1312, Abu Bakr II sailed into the Atlantic and disappeared from the written history of Africa. European historians would later dismiss this story as fantasy, myth, or the exaggerated imagination of a primitive ruler. But what if he succeeded? What if Africa reached the Americas centuries before Europe even considered the possibility? The evidence, if you're willing to see it, is overwhelming. When Spanish conquistadors stormed Central and South America in the 1500s, they uncovered something that contradicted their narrative of discovery. Scattered across the region were gigantic stone heads carved by the ancient Olmec civilization. Some weighed 50 tons. These weren't abstract figures. They had distinctly African facial features: broad noses, full lips, textured hair that resembled braids or locks. The resemblance wasn't vague or interpretive. It was unmistakable. The Olmec, living more than 3,000 years before the Spaniards arrived, had clearly encountered people of African appearance. They carved them into monuments meant to last forever. And these weren't isolated pieces. Sculptures from later Mesoamerican cultures echoed those same features, hinting at continuous contact over long periods. Indigenous oral histories throughout Mexico, Central America, and South America tell similar stories, stories colonizers tried desperately to silence. They describe dark-skinned visitors arriving from the east, bringing metallurgy, agricultural knowledge, and goods for trade. The Maya and Aztec preserved legends of dark-skinned travelers and deities who came across the sea long before Europeans arrived. Even Christopher Columbus, championed as the discoverer of the New World, admitted something astonishing in his own journal. Indigenous people told him that black traders had reached the Americas before him, carrying spears tipped with a metal called guanin. Chemical analysis reveals that guanin is a precise mixture of gold, copper, and silver identical to the alloys produced in West Africa. But European scholars ignored all of it. They had already created a worldview that justified slavery and colonization by insisting that Africa was uncivilized and that the Americas were uninhabited waiting rooms for European progress. Accepting that Africans crossed the Atlantic, shared technologies, and contributed to pre-Columbian civilizations would destroy their entire narrative. So they buried the evidence. The colossal heads were dismissed as artistic invention. Indigenous stories were labeled primitive mythology. Columbus's journal entries were chalked up to misunderstanding or miscommunication. African and indigenous scholars who tried to connect the dots were mocked, denied academic space and forced to the margins. The suppression wasn't accidental. It was intentional. Spanish priests burned thousands of codices, written texts that documented indigenous histories in detail. Those books might have contained precise records of African visitors, but they were turned to ash. Art depicting African features was reinterpreted or hidden. Museums stored pieces away from public view. European historians collectively protected a narrative that placed themselves at the center of human progress while portraying Africa as a passive continent waiting to be conquered. But evidence doesn't vanish just because it's inconvenient. Throughout the 20th century, more proof surfaced. Botanists discovered that certain plants, like the bottle gourd and particular cotton varieties, existed on both sides of the Atlantic thousands of years before European arrival. DNA testing proved these weren't independent species. They were the same plants, genetically identical, meaning someone transported them across the ocean. The sweet potato, native to South America, appeared in Africa and Polynesia centuries before Columbus. How did a plant travel thousands of miles without seafaring contact? It didn't. People carried it. Linguistic research revealed even more. Words from Mande languages, the same linguistic family spoken in the Mali Empire, appear in indigenous tongues across the Caribbean and Central America. Words relating to trade, gold, food crops, and boat-making. These weren't faint coincidences. They were linguistic fingerprints. Modern oceanographers found that the Atlantic currents naturally carry ships from West Africa to South America within weeks. In fact, the route is easier than the one Columbus used. Abu Bakri's journey wasn't only possible, it was the most logical path. In 1976, Guyanese scholar Dr. Ivan van Sertima published They Came Before Columbus, a groundbreaking work compiling archaeology, linguistics, metallurgy, plant genetics, and maritime studies into one damning conclusion. Africans reached the Americas long before Europeans. The establishment attacked him fiercely. They called his work pseudoscience, Afrocentric fantasy, and baseless speculation. Universities blocked his research. But van Sertima challenged every critique with evidence. And slowly, reluctantly, scholars began admitting he might be right. Here's what they still don't want you to understand. When Abu Bakr II sailed west with thousands of ships, he wasn't chasing a fantasy. He was following currents African fishermen likely knew for generations. And when his fleet reached the Americas, likely somewhere along the northern coasts of South or Central America, they didn't arrive as conquerors. They arrived as traders. They brought metallurgy, agricultural knowledge, nautical technology, and gold tools. The people they encountered weren't primitive. They were advanced civilizations with mathematics, architecture, astronomy, and writing. The two worlds exchanged ideas. They traded. They learned from each other. The colossal Olmec heads weren't random. They were portraits, tributes to African visitors who earned respect, maybe even reverence. Sudden advancements in metallurgy, agriculture, and ceremonial art across certain Mesoamerican regions around the 1300s weren't coincidental. They aligned with the timeline of Malian exploration. For decades, even centuries, there may have been African settlements along the American coasts. Small trading hubs, cultural exchange centers, connected worlds. Then the Spanish arrived. And everything changed. European colonizers didn't just conquer civilizations. They erased them. They burned libraries, destroyed artwork, killed millions, and rewrote entire histories. Any trace of African presence had to be eliminated because it threatened the foundation of colonial ideology. If Africans had crossed oceans, built ships, shaped cultures, and engaged in global trade, then the entire justification for the transatlantic slave trade collapsed. And that's why this history was buried so brutally. Musa Abu Bakr II's expedition likely succeeded. There is too much evidence, too many parallels, too many matching clues for it to be dismissed as fantasy. Somewhere in the Americas, African explorers made contact, built relationships, exchanged knowledge, perhaps even established communities. And then colonization wiped out that memory. We may never know the full truth. The codices that recorded these encounters were burned. The sculptures that depicted African visitors were hidden. The stories that preserved the timelines were labeled as myths. But despite the destruction, enough remains to expose the lie. Africa was not waiting to be discovered. Africans were explorers, navigators, innovators, empire builders. They crossed oceans. They shaped civilizations from the Mediterranean to the Americas. And when their achievements became inconvenient for European expansion, history was rewritten. History isn't only written by the victors. It's erased by them, piece by piece, book by book, stone by stone. For centuries, The world was told that Africa contributed nothing to global civilization except labor. That lie justified atrocities. But erased history doesn't die. It waits, buried under centuries of distortion, until someone brave enough uncovers it. Somewhere in West Africa, a king once looked at the horizon and refused to believe the world ended there. He built ships, gathered his people, and sailed into the unknown. Whether he appears in textbooks or not, his journey happened. The proof is carved in stone, rooted in crops, hidden in language, and whispered through surviving indigenous memory. The story never began with Columbus. It began centuries earlier, when African sails disappeared beyond the Atlantic, carrying a truth that refused to stay buried.